Hello, my friends. I thought I'd do a quick IA2 study preparation video to see if I could help you prepare and get ready for the interim assessment 2. This video is being recorded on November 1st, 2017, so the date that everything says that it's due may or may not be valid because I'll probably use this for other classes, so don't be shocked if you see the wrong day or the wrong time. Just make sure that you go look. It's in the content pages. So I do have some study resources. I have a great collection of Quizlets and videos that you might want to use. There is a Google Doc, which I'll put in the description of this recording on the content page. But we do need to study because sadly, unlike Flynn Rider, we can't all make it on our charm and good looks alone. All right, so we're going to talk first about our good friend Wundt, Mr. Wonderful himself, who was one of the leaders of the structuralist school of thought. They wanted to try and figure out a way to analyze the adult mind and try and kind of figure out the simplest definable components. I always think about Legos. They were basically trying to break the mind down into the littlest Lego pieces they could to see how it was structured. And they were doing it through sensory information, which was great, except for the problem that we all have a different a perception of our senses. And so if you and I both, let's say, sniff a smell, and you say, wow, that's a great smell, and I say, oh, I can't stand that smell, it gives me a headache, we're both valid, but what exactly have we learned from that? Not a whole lot about who we are as people. I mean, there is value, but not as much. But Wundt is also, of course, remember, the father of psychology because he added the scientific method. So he still did quite a bit for psychology, making it a real science instead of a pseudoscience, something that couldn't be proven scientifically. And as we know, there are 7 approaches in psychology. We have talked in Unit 2 about the neurobiological or the biological, what's going on in the brain, the nervous system, our hormones, our genetics, what's going on throughout our body, how it affects our behavior. In Unit 3, we focused on behavioral psychology, which gets into the learning process, the idea of external behaviors and learning being long-term change over time. And it focuses a lot on negative and positive stimuli and our reaction to them. So remember, behavioral is for the most part external, what you can see. So right now, what you can see of me. Am I calm? Am I angry? What kind of behaviors am I displaying? I'm using my hands because I'm that kind of person. You can learn a lot about a person that way. In Unit 4, we're focusing more on cognitive, humanistic, and psychodynamic. Cognitive is our mental processes. You think about Jean Piaget and how children develop in their mental processes as they get older. Erickson talked about that. The humanistic, that's all Maslow. There's many others, but Maslow is our big key guy. And the idea that we can take control of our lives, we can grow, we can move to the best version of ourselves. And psychodynamic, move this down a little bit, that our behavior comes from unconscious drives and conflicts, especially when it comes to sexual or aggressive instincts that kind of collide with what's appropriate in our culture around us. And we haven't focused as much on evolutionary and sociocultural. Evolutionary gets into natural selection of traits, how our environment has shaped us the way it is. So how we have evolved, looking at our families, how we have evolved through our families and our cultures. And then socioculture gets into how our culture, the media, our religion, how that can affect us and our thinking. All right, so some parts of the brain. We remember the corpus callosum, who is connecting the 2 hemispheres of the cerebral cortex, the left and right, so they can talk to each other. We have our hypothalamus, which basically is our hormone central. The hormones for thirst, hunger, sleep, mood, our sex drive, our temperature, all of these hormones, the hypothalamus is responsible for shooting those out. We have the thalamus. Oh, 2 of them came along. The thalamus, which processes all the sensory information that comes through our spinal cord up to our cerebellum into our thalamus, and our thalamus says, oh, okay, that's, optic, it goes over here. This is hearing, that goes to the temporal lobe, so it moves things around. And then, of course, the hippocampus, the part of the brain that turns our short-term memories into our long-term memories. That's what we really want to focus on it doing. It does other things, but just remember, when you're struggling, when you're having trouble getting some long-term memories in, just reach up here, give your hippocampus a little love. It will appreciate that. All right, so our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous systems. The central nervous system is basically, if you think about the center of our body, our brain down through our spinal cord, okay? And so it's the center. Everything comes to it. It processes it and then sends it back out. Okay, so the fact that I moved my hands, that was my central nervous system telling my peripheral nervous system, you know what she does with her hands, just make her do it again. The peripheral system is that bridge. It goes from the center, from our central system, out to the various parts of our body. And these nerves are super, super tiny. Some of them we can't even see, but they're extremely important. And some parts of the peripheral nervous system, I'm going to move myself up here. I know, I feel like I'm jumping all over the place. The somatic nervous system, which carries sensory information and motor information. So basically, do you want to move your muscles? Do I want to move my hands so I can talk to you? My somatic nervous system has to fire to the motor neurons. The brain says, hey, fire, and they go, okay. But then you have your autonomic nervous system, and that's basically regulating everything we don't really think about. I mean, after you eat, you don't sit there and go, okay, stomach, digest, digest, digest. You got everything? Okay, now stomach, send it down to the colon. We don't have to do that. Thankfully, we have an automatic system basically that's handling all of that for us. And we have two branches. I really want to focus on these. One is our friend, the sympathetic system. It's the fight or flight response whenever we have a challenge. For example, the interim assessment 2. How many of you are thinking, oh man, I don't want to take this test? Well, if you say, okay, I don't want to take it, but I got it, so I'm going to study and do my best. That's your sympathetic system gearing you up to fight. If you say, I am going to put this off to the last moment, that is your sympathetic system gearing you to flee. And if you're like, oh, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do, that's your sympathetic system causing you to freeze. So this is the one that helps you handle the situation. It's sympathetic to the fact that you have a situation to deal with. Your parasympathetic system, on the other hand, is your rest and digest system. Whenever you eat something, you know how you feel a bit sleepy, this is your parasympathetic system kind of shutting down other systems to focus on it. But it also says, okay, wait, calm down. Breathe. Let's figure out how we can approach this. So sympathetic gets us hyped up, and parasympathetic brings us down, helps us conserve our resources. All right, we have some great vocabulary from Unit 3 when we get into behaviorism, classical conditioning. The unconditioned response, the unconditioned stimulus. These are the things that we generally say no one's taught you, although with that being said, if you've been taught something and now it's the way you respond and we're trying to change it again, sometimes that can be considered the unconditioned response. But basically, it's what you do in response to the unconditioned stimulus, something that no one said to you. For example, if I shine a light in your eyes, maybe put your hands up to block yourself. That's your unconditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus being that light in the eyes. The neutral stimulus is something you either don't really have a reaction to or something that you're going to be trained to have a reaction to. Okay? So, like we talked about before, this pen. Oh, I froze. Sorry about that. This pen right here. Okay, you don't really have a reaction. I mean, I don't think any of you looked at this pen and went, oh my gosh, but I could if you were really afraid of, I don't know, I don't want to terrify anybody. Let's just imagine, just go with me here for a moment, that this little glass kitty cat terrified you. Okay, I'm trying to find some things, I don't want to traumatize anybody. But let's say this little glass kitty cat terrified you. So I showed it to you and you went, oh no, not the glass kitty cat. That's your unconditioned response. I can take this neutral stimulus, I can pair the two together, and eventually when I show you the neutral stimulus, you're like, no, not the pen, because you become conditioned. The same reaction you have to your unconditioned stimulus, you will eventually have to the conditioned stimulus. That's your conditioned response. Basically the difference, what's learned versus unlearned, what you have naturally versus what the environment has trained you to do. All right, a few other fun terms from classical conditioning. Acquisition. How long does it take the creature, the kid, the adult, the child, the animal to learn the association between like I was saying before, the glass kitty cat, don't scream, and the pen? Some people may get it very quickly. Some people, may take longer. So that's kind of something you're looking at, is how long does it take to acquire? Generalization. When, for example, a baby sees a dog and knows that what a doggy is, but sees a wolf or a kitty cat and calls it doggy because it has 4 legs. So you're not able to distinguish between stimuli. When you first get a phone and it rings and beeps and dings and you're like, I don't know what any of those mean, that's generalization. You know it's giving you an alert, but you don't know which alert it is. But once you learn to recognize the different sounds, or you change your settings for yourself so that you can recognize it, if you hear a ding, you say, oh, that's a text message. If you hear your favorite song, oh, that's a phone call. So you can discriminate between the stimuli. You know what each stimuli is. And extinction. Over time, if I keep showing you this pen, there's going to come a point where you're like, why was I scared of that pen again? It's just a pen, no biggie. So if we don't reinforce the conditioned stimulus with the terrifying glass kitty cat, the unconditioned stimulus, over time you'll stop putting that together. But it wouldn't take long once I showed you the kitty cat again. I know you were terrified again. It wouldn't take long for you to put it back together because you already had that learning in you, and so by putting it back together, you could have a spontaneous recovery. All right, moving on to operant conditioning, and our friend B.F. Skinner. Doesn't stand for best friend, it stands for Burris Frederick, but you could think of him as your best friend when it comes to behaviorism. Operant conditioning deals with operants, intentional actions, something that is done intentionally to have an effect on your surrounding environment. So something you do, a behavior that you display to affect your environment. And as I mentioned, BF was the leader here. And basically it's a learning process. So if you're doing something that needs to be reinforced, then you might have a stimulus to reinforce it. If you're doing something that should be decreased, then you're going to need a stimulus to decrease it. And learning comes from your reactions to those stimulus. So here we have Sheldon, who's pretty positive he's right. I know that's a shock. So remember that in operant conditioning, positive means applying a stimulus. So it can be a stimulus like I offer you a piece of chocolate, or it can be a stimulus like I assign you extra homework. Okay, so it's not always positive meaning like, yay, thank you, I wanted that. Sometimes it's like, it's just applying a stimulus. And then, of course, negative is the exact opposite, withholding a stimulus or removing a negative stimulus. So positive reinforcement, this will increase behavior because it's going to give you something good, something that you want. Generally, it's designed to enhance the frequency of the behavior we want. Negative reinforcement is going to decrease the it's going to increase the behavior because it's going to take away something that is negative, something you don't want. Okay, I know it's confusing positive and negative. So for example, let's imagine that I'm looking around my house trying to think of one. Let's imagine that after you use the computer, you're supposed to turn it off, except you never do. Well, positive reinforcement could be every time you turn off the computer, I might say, hey, you turned off the computer, thank you. Okay, just it doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be wild and crazy. Negative reinforcement could be that I won't nag you. I won't get all over your case. But you don't, whoops, sorry, I just took myself away. Sorry about that, guys. Technical difficulties. Um, Ay, negative, but then there's also the concept of a punishment. So decreasing a behavior because it gives you something unwanted. So if you don't turn off your computer, I might say to you, did you turn off the computer? Really? How many times have I asked you to turn off the computer? That's nagging. So if you turn it off, I'm not going to nag you. I'm going to withhold the nagging. That's a negative reinforcement. And I'm going to give you something positive. I'm going to say, hey, good job. Thank you so much. So basically, it's a system of increasing the behavior you want, decreasing the behavior you don't. Now, a big part of this is something called shaping, because sometimes the target behavior is so far away from what you're able to do. Let's imagine that what I want you to really do every time you're done is I want you to turn off the laptop, close it up, put it away in the drawer, and then take the chair and put it back into the kitchen. Okay, let's just imagine that you have to use a makeshift table when you study. Well, at your age, being teenagers, I probably could expect that. But let's say I've got a little 6-year-old. 6-year-old may not be able to move that chair, may not be able to lift the laptop. So I may have to get the 6-year-old there in stages, and I could use shaping to do it. So another instant, here's my other example. Let's imagine that I want my child to put away her laundry. Okay, I have 3 girls, and I want them to be able to put away their own laundry. Well, again, starting say about 5 or 6, I probably can't look at that child and say, take your laundry to your room, put it away. The kid's going to be like, where's my laundry, you know? So I'm going to have to start with something simple, with shaping. So I'm going to reward that child to get the child closer and closer to the desired behavior. So I'm looking for a target behavior, but I can't get them there right away. So maybe first I say, hey, I just put your laundry into the basket. I pulled it out of the dryer. Could you go put that in your room? Yay, there you go. Hey, good job. Thanks for all your help. Next, I'm going to say, okay, you know, once the child's pretty comfortable with it and is just putting, you know, always taking the basket to the room, I might, after a few months, start with the next one. Hey, let's take out your jeans and t-shirts and I'll show you how to fold them, and then you can be responsible for putting those away. So in the beginning, I may have to stand there and kind of, oh, remember, we fold the jeans in half, then we fold them over. Or, you know, okay, no, shirts go in that drawer. But if I keep a routine and I'm always giving positive reinforcement for what's done correctly, I'm going to get them closer to that behavior. And then after a while, it's going to become routine. I'm going to be able to say, hey, now I want you to hang up your dresses. I have girls. Okay, now I want you to put your laundry basket in the laundry room. So over time, I can keep adding a step until it becomes one long routine, and I can say, hey, go do your laundry. So that's shaping, getting someone closer and closer through smaller steps. All right, and as I remember, there was a third friend of ours, Mr. Albert Bandura, who came up with the idea of social cognitive behaviorism, also called the social learning or observational theory. And he said human beings can learn not just by doing, but by seeing. So they can identify people that they can observe, they can model after. So for example, with my little daughters, I have twins who are younger, I asked my older child to demonstrate for them how she put her jeans into the drawer so they could see, oh, okay, this is a good model of what I need to do. And so basically the idea is it's very external still, but you do need to take into account things like beliefs, self-perceptions, and expectations. So it's a little more internal than our other friends. Whoops, I clicked something I shouldn't have. There we go. So Albert Bandura was especially interested in the concept of violence on TV or movies or video games that could possibly, well, not video games, they didn't have those, but how those could possibly lead children to behave. Because the belief was if you have an aggressive child, you have the aggressive child watch violent TV or movies so that they could purge all of that aggressiveness and they would be less aggressive. Does it work? Well, basically, Bandura went through a whole experiment about this, and he really worked hard. He called it the Bobo doll study. Here's a picture of a Bobo doll. And he was very careful. He had 36 boys, 36 girls, various ages between 3 and 6. And in both cases, they were watching adults behave either aggressively or not aggressively to a doll. And I do have a link that you can watch, but basically the question is what happened as a result? Because people were pretty sure he was going to come back and say, no, it doesn't lead him to be aggressive at all. Well, what do you think? Well, as you can imagine, the children who saw adults striking and kicking the Bobo doll were more likely to do it, especially if it was a boy watching a man or a girl watching a woman, someone they could identify with. And they found that even 8 months later, 40% of those children continued to have that aggressive behavior. Move myself up here a little bit. And Bandura and his colleagues predicted that children in the non-aggressive group would behave less aggressively, and they were correct. The children who didn't see aggression tended not to act out the aggression. They also predicted boys would be more aggressive than girls, and they showed that was correct too. Girls were less likely, about half as much, to be aggressive. So what this teaches us is we can learn through observation. But there were some other pressing questions at this time, and one was the idea of the nature of love and attachment. How important is it? I mean, again, something to keep in mind. We may be sitting here thinking, duh, they had to research this, but if we didn't research it, you and I wouldn't be sitting here thinking, duh. These were pressing questions, and what was going on was there were children who were going to orphanages in the 30s in particular, as parents passed away or couldn't take care of the kids. And some of these kids were going in and they were okay, but some were just sort of going into their room and kind of wasting away. And people couldn't figure out what was wrong with these kids. It was called marasmus syndrome. So Harry Harlow took baby rhesus monkeys, who behave very similarly to human children, and he made an experiment. And he took them away from their moms, and he created two mothers, one that was made out of wire but had food, and one that was made out of cloth, which had no food. And he found that the babies might go to the wire mom just to get the food, but they spent most of their time with the cloth mom, especially when they were scared or nervous. They would wrap themselves around the cloth mom, hug it, pet it, play with it, try to groom it. He also tried an experiment where he separated the monkeys from their mothers shortly after birth and completely isolated them. And when he brought them back after 4 or 6 months to the company of other monkeys, he found they could not communicate or socialize because they hadn't observed and learned those behaviors. So that goes back to Bandura's idea of being able to observe behavior. So why even bother with this? I mean, what does this even teach us about humans or monkeys? It teaches us that attachment and social behavior are extremely important for monkeys and humans, and that there has to be not only health care in hospitals or orphanages, but emotional care as well, so that the patients can thrive and continue to get better. Our friend Jean Piaget, Mr. Study of Children. Piaget was kind of the first psychologist to look at kids because, well, let me back up here. Kids were seen for a very long time as like miniature adults. They were supposed to behave like miniature adults. There wasn't a whole lot of acceptance of the fact that they were kids and they may not be able to behave as well. If you couldn't behave, you just weren't seen. That's why very often children of kings and queens, for example, wouldn't even show up till they were like 11. But Piaget said, okay, wait a minute, there's something more going on with these kids than just goofing around and playing. They are building schema. Each time they do something, they're changing their mental map and they're learning more about their world. Sorry. And he said that when we learn something new, children basically, and even as adults, but he focused on kids, they take this information and they either assimilate it or they accommodate it. So when they assimilate it, they either try to figure out what you already know and just stick it in as a piece of that. So for example, if you like soup and I give you a new type of soup, you would probably assimilate it as a type of soup. But accommodation would be expanding or creating new schema based on what we know. So if you like soup and I was to give you, I'm trying to think of something not too soupy, like chili. Okay, chili is not really soup. You might start to put that in their soup and then go, well, now wait a minute, it's not liquid like the other soups, and it's kind of spicy, and most soups I've tried aren't that spicy, or maybe they are, I don't know. I'm going to make a new category. That's something different. Chili is not soup. That's accommodation. And you can see here there's another example, the idea of trying to figure out if a porpoise is like what we already know is a fish, or is the porpoise something different? So Piaget said, okay, look, kids are actually going through 4 stages of cognitive development. In the first stage, which approximately birth to 2 years, these are just approximate ages, they're trying to figure out how to use their motor functions. You've watched little kids and they like do funny things or they try to walk in weird ways and you're like, what are you doing? They're trying to figure out how their bodies work. And object permanence is a big thing in this stage. The idea that just because you can't see something doesn't mean it disappears. So when you play peekaboo, for example, with a baby, before 9 months, they think you're like magic. You're appearing, you're disappearing, woohoo, pulling it out of thin air. But then eventually they come to realize, I can't see it. Doesn't mean it's not there. Children ages, say, about 2 to 6 go into the pre-operational stage. You've dealt with 4-year-olds. They never stop talking. Oh my goodness, they talk all the time. Well, that's because in this stage there is so much acceleration of language and schema formation. I mean, their brains are like exploding. There is new stuff going off in there all the time. And one of their ways of processing it is to talk about it and get it out and tell you it's funny, and they have to verbalize it. Generally, in the pre-operational stage, children are egocentric. They have to recognize, they see the world from their perspective. Over time, they will begin to look beyond their perspective and say, you like broccoli? Well, I mean, I ate broccoli, but okay, if you like it, you can eat it. There's also animism, the inanimate objects being alive and conscious. This might be having an imaginary friend or a stuffed animal that you talk to. It could also be the idea that if you tell kids there's fairies who live in the trees, ooh, the trees are alive with fairies. You know, they would understand that sort of thing. Lots of imagination. Next, we have the concrete operational stage, which is kind of like elementary school to kind of a little bit into middle school. There is an adult-like way of thinking, but with things you can see or touch or somehow break into a concrete piece. And one of the big things in this stage is law of conservation of matter. So you notice this little boy has a rope of clay. This little boy has a ball of clay. And so they begin to understand that you can change the shape and still have the same amount. And last but not least, where most of my friends are today, the formal operational stage, which is the concept of abstract thinking. Things that we can't really touch or see, like democracy, love, your home budget. It's kind of hard for you to actually physically go to the credit card company and start picking up big chunks of credit card numbers. But logic becomes greater. You know, this is where, for example, I'm sure you've heard this one, if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, what is A's relation to C? You're able to start putting things together logically. And you would understand, for example, why Freud is telling you don't buy a book on reverse psychology. And if you don't worry, I'll explain it. Whoop, sorry, click. Okay. All right, so we move on to our friend in the cognitive development psychology, Lawrence Kohlberg, who looked at our moral development. So Piaget looked at how we think. Kohlberg looked at how we react to others, how we relate. And he came up with 6 stages. The self-interest stage, which is pre-conventional, which is all about me. What can I have? How can I benefit? Stage 1 is I'm not going to do something that'll get me in trouble. Stage 2 is I'll do it, but only if you do something for me. Stage 3 is where you start to kind of incorporate society into your way of thinking, the conventional level. In the next stage, I should say, stage 3, you're worried about people around you. What are they going to think if I do this? Ooh, if I wear this top, is my friend going to think it's stupid? Or, well, I like that girl, but I can't tell her because my friends might make fun of me. And then stage 4, the law and order stage. This is the one where the rules of society are pretty much the rules you follow, and most people stay in stage 4. They believe that established laws outweigh pretty much any other way of thinking about things. But some people are able to move on to the post-conventional level, which is where your internal principles matter more than the laws. So you're aware of the laws. You know what the consequences are. You're willing to accept the consequences if you have to break a law that you think is unfair or wrong. That could be an official law, but that could also be, for example, if you know that everybody in the neighborhood wants to put up a sign, but you think it's a terrible sign, and you know that if you say this is a terrible sign, they'll all be upset with you. If you're in stage 5 or stage 6, you're going to say, hey guys, look, I'm sorry, this is a terrible sign. I think it's a terrible idea. You will accept the consequence of everyone being angry at you. It's not really a law, but you're willing to accept it. All right, then we come to our friend Vygotsky and his sociocultural cognitive development. Vygotsky looked at learning, and learning specifically in schools, and what really impacts it. And he came up with this concept that if we are inside our comfort zone, we're not learning. We're just stuck. If we are pushed too far outside of our comfort zone, it's such challenge that we're like, no, no, no. So we've got to get in this sweet spot right in the middle, what he called the ZPD, the zone of proximal development, where we are pushed to learn, but we're not pushed so far that we're frustrated and challenged. So for example, the ZPD, you would use scaffolding. So it may be something that's more than you can learn, but you could learn it with help. And so Vygotsky said that teachers are extremely important to learning. There needs to be someone there who can recognize how far a child can go and help them move to the next level. And scaffolding can be anything designed to stretch you and to help you learn. It can be Kahoot. It can be a graphic organizer. It can be a learner conference. Anything that with some support helps you get to the next stage and be able to do something on your own. All right, and then we have our friend Erickson. Don't want to cover Erickson up there. Erickson said that we go through psychosocial development stages, basically how we relate to others. And as we go through each conflict, if we're able to resolve it and succeed, then we are going to be successful in life. If we have a conflict that we can't really resolve, he said that there's going to be basically a problem that follows us the rest of our life. So for example, with an infant who forms a loving relationship with her caregiver will trust others. One who doesn't will probably never really trust people. Most of my students are at the adolescent stage, trying to figure out who you are. If you are successful, then you may sometimes struggle a little bit with the people around you and trying to meet their expectations, but ultimately you're going to be able to understand your own identity. Role confusion being you're never going to get past what others want of you. You're always going to be a follower. All right. All right, let's consider the structure of personality according to Freud. Freud believed that we related to everything from birth through death through a sexual factor, basically pleasure, what gives us pleasure. And it may be kind of an uncomfortable topic to discuss because we look at it differently, but when he says sex, he kind of refers to physical pleasure. Sometimes what we consider physical pleasure, he would have considered like a sexual thing that we wouldn't look at it that way. He doesn't necessarily mean sex the way we see it, although sometimes he does. Not everyone agrees with Freud, and that's okay, but it's important to understand his thinking to see where he was coming from. So he said the first part, I don't know why that didn't come up, but the first part is called the id, I-D. I don't know why that didn't come up, sorry. The id is in our unconscious mind. This is our instincts, and it's always looking for pleasure, meaning it's always looking for the thing that makes us happy, basically. It's kind of immoral. I mean, it would steal from other people, or it would hurt somebody if it could get what it wanted. So according to him, the id is kind of the part that we push down. We're not even aware of it. But you've been in that situation before where you know you really needed to study for a test, but your favorite movie's on TV, and you haven't seen it in so long, and you just want a break. That's your id going, come on, go watch the movie. I want to watch a movie. I don't want to do this. It's boring. But then you go, all right, I don't want to do this, but I really have to study for the test. That's your ego talking. Your ego is in your conscious mind. And your ego is the one that looks at reality and kind of organizes everything. So it's the one saying, all right, I know you don't want to study, but guess what? We got to study, so deal with it. Then you have the third part known as the superego. And again, I don't know why this is not showing up. There we go. There's the id. There's the superego. The superego is kind of in between. Part of it's conscious, part of it's unconscious. He called it the preconscious mind. And it's like your conscience. It's the one telling you what's right or wrong. You know, if you don't get a good grade on that test, your mom's going to be really disappointed, your teacher's going to be frustrated. You really need to go do that. It's kind of your guiding moral principle. Now, according to Freud, as long as all of these are in balance, you're okay. But if your id takes over too much, you're never really going to have any rules or boundaries. You know those people. It's like they never seem to know what's right or wrong. They just do whatever they want. If your ego's in charge, you're going to be cold. You're going to be distant and emotionalist. You're going to look at the world completely through the lens of rules and regulations. You know, for example, last night, it was Halloween, and my daughters wanted to go trick-or-treating. Now, they're supposed to do their chores every afternoon, but I let them not do the chores even though they're supposed to because it was Halloween and I gave them a break. The ego inside of me is saying, the rules say they must do their chores, but the id is saying, give them a break. Okay? And so sometimes you need to know how to balance those two. The superego, when it's in control, you have a problem where you're either really guilty. You know those people like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it. And you're thinking, you didn't do anything. Or you've met those people who they can rationalize anything. Well, I'm going to go do trick or treat, and I don't care if I've got a test tomorrow. You know what? The teacher was rude to me last week, so I'm not even going to bother studying for her test. That's what she gets. So when you've got this out of balance, it can cause problems with you being able to balance and focus your life. All right, so Freud goes through about 5 stages, the first one being the oral stage, where the baby or the child puts things in their mouth, feeding, sucking, biting things. And so through this process, they have to learn that the mouth is not the only way to interact with the world. If a fixation occurs, then this could be a child who becomes overly aggressive or dependent. They might drink, overeat, smoke, they might bite their nails. The anal stage is the idea of being able to control the expulsion of your feces. Basically, if you think about potty training, being able to poop on the toilet versus in your diaper. Children are able to learn how to control that, and they feel good about themselves because they can control it and do it in the correct place. If a parent is like, you pooped in your diaper, I can't believe it, how many times have I told you not to poop in your diaper, and makes the kid feel really bad about this, then it could lead them to become overly shameful. They could also become extremely unorganized and messy and feel very incompetent and unable to do anything. People who or they might go the opposite direction with what we call, if you've ever heard, anal retentive. They are so focused on control that they can't ever let it go. The phallic stage. Generally, this comes around 4 to 6, and this is kind of where kids start to realize, hey, boys and girls are different. They've got different body parts. These different body parts may do different things. And this is where you get into the concept of the sex organs. What are they? What do they do? This is where some of those interesting questions can pop out, but kids begin starting to sort of notice this about themselves. And then you get to the latency stage, which is sort of elementary through middle school, which is where, according to Freud, kids kind of cut off from the idea of sexuality and they find pleasure by hanging out with their own sex. You know, boys have cooties, girls are gross. So they start to be more interested in having that time with their friends. And the last one, which is the one that lasts the longest, is called the genital stage. 13 and above, this is where there's attraction, Freud said, towards the opposite sex. Today we might choose to look at that differently, but basically the idea of having a partner, fulfilling the needs of the partner, seeking pleasure sexually, and being able to give and receive love. That's basically what's going on in this stage. Okay, according to Freud, we have a lot of defense mechanisms going on. Whenever something comes up that we don't like, whenever there's some kind of conflict, we may choose to use one of these methods to get away from it. One, for example, repression. We're just going to, it didn't happen, it didn't exist. denial, same sort of thing. Projection is where you have a feeling about someone, but you know it may or may not be a feeling that that person returns or is even appropriate. For example, maybe I'm mad at this girl at school, and I don't really know why, and I'm not even sure it's acceptable, but then one day she's walking down the hall and she drops her book right next to me and it makes a loud noise. And I'm like, she did that on purpose. She tried to scare me. She doesn't like me either. So I'm taking my feelings and projecting them on her. Displacement is when I satisfy an impulse I have with a different object. So like maybe I'm really mad at my mom and dad because I said I can't go to the movies, and I'm like, oh, I can't punch my parents. No. But maybe I go in my room and I punch the pillow. I'm displacing my anger. Regression, you sometimes see this with little kids in particular when they have a new baby brother or sister where they used the potty just fine, but now they quit using the potty, they go backwards in time. And then sublimation would be taking that impulse, that anger and frustration at my parents, and using it in a socially acceptable way. Let's say I go in my room and I'm like, I'm so mad at my parents, and I just start cleaning my room. I mean, just cleaning it, and I get it spotless. That would be sublimation, because now I've taken all the anger and frustration and I've put it into an acceptable idea. All right, my friends, we are getting there. Moving on to the memory process. In order for me to remember something, there are 3 steps it has to go through. First, it has to get into the memory system. So it has to come in through my sensory information. Whether you're hearing my voice, whether you see my face, whether you smell something in the room, that information enters, but most of the time we get rid of it. Of course, not the sound of my voice, because you're listening to everything I'm saying. So at first, we have this piece that comes in and we register it in our sensory memory. That becomes an icon. Next, we have a bit, which is where we take all of this lovely information I'm saying and we stick it in our short-term memory to hold on to it. Maybe you're taking notes as you go so that you can remember things. This is in your short-term memory. And last, we have retrieval, the engram. Once we get this into long-term memory, we can actually get to it anytime we want for the rest of our lives. Sometimes we may have to remind ourselves of how to get to it, but we can get the information out. So these are the 3 parts of memory storage. So as I mentioned, it goes in our sensory memory. It's usually forgotten. But if it does manage to get remembered, it can go into short term, and if we rehearse it and we practice it, it will go into long term. A lot of what goes in our short term memory, though, we don't remember. That's why, have you ever done this? You get up, you walk out of the room, and you go, wait a minute, why was I going in my bedroom? Oh, shoot, I know I was going in my bedroom. That's because what was in short term memory popped right out, and we didn't rehearse it to get it into long term. All right, so we can have 2 different kinds of long term memory. The first is called explicit memories. Sorry, I had to click extra there. Explicit memories are divided into 2 parts. One is called episodic. Episodes, things that happen to us, personally experienced events like vacation or the best class you ever took, things like that, which I know is psychology, right? I'm just kidding. Semantic memories. This is your factual memories. So the information I'm giving you, the facts I'm teaching you, are going into your semantic memory, I hope. But we also have implicit memories. Memories that we honestly do, and we have them as memories, but we don't really think of them as such. And these are our procedural memories. For example, if you write your name, you don't have to stop usually and say, how does an A go? How does a B go? Whatever letters you need. You just pick up the pen and write. That's a procedural memory. It technically is a memory, but it's one that is so ingrained in you. It's muscle memory. All right, and so I've given you some examples we would see. All right, so what happens is that sometimes we have this great memory, it's encoded, it's stored, but we can't seem to get it out, you know? And so when there can be a retrieval failure, it can happen for one of 3 reasons. One is called retroactive interference. So we get this new information which blocks our old information. Proactive interference, where we get old information that blocks the new. So for example, let's say I say to you, hey, what was the name of your Spanish teacher last year? And you say, well, my new Spanish teacher is Miss Lee, but my old Spanish teacher was, oh shoot, I can't think of her name. All I can remember is Miss Lee. That's retroactive. Or let's say that you your mom says, what's the name of your math teacher? And you say, well, last year I had Miss Brown, but this year I have, I can't remember the new teacher's name. That's proactive interference. And then my favorite named one is tip of the tongue syndrome. You've done that. Oh my gosh, I know her name, I know her name, I know her name. Why do I can't remember the name. She was in math class with me. She sat behind me. She had long blonde hair. Now she's the short hair. You know it, but for some reason there's a mental block due to stress that is stopping the information from coming up. You know, like when you're taking a test and you can't remember the answer, and then like an hour later you're like, oh, it was this. Tip of the tongue. What do you need to do to remember this information? How do you get rid of any of these 3 methods of forgetting? You're going to love this one. You got to relax. You got to change what your brain is doing. For example, maybe you just need to take a moment and tap out a rhythm on your desk and just focus on that and get away from what you're trying to do. Maybe you need to stand up and walk around the kitchen table a couple times. If you're in a situation, you need to say, you know what, it's going to come to me later. Just put it out of your brain. You've heard that one? Just put it out of your brain. It'll come back. When you can relax that mental block, it will show up. All right, so we have different kinds of memories. I am going to point out the concept of shallow processing. Sometimes you study just long enough to remember the information for the test. You'd never do that for psychology, right? And then you forget it right afterwards. That's shallow processing. I'm just going to get it just long enough to get the information I need. We've discussed most of these. Echoic memory, this is what we hear because we have a little bit longer with what we hear than any of the other senses. We get about 3 to 4 seconds. Rehearsal, this is how we move things from short-term to long-term memory. And chunking. Sometimes we can take information that we learn, we can kind of put it together as one piece, and then we can learn it that way, and we can extend our short-term memory. So for example, if I said George Washington, there's probably several thoughts that come into your head because you've chunked all of that information together about George Washington being the first United States president, being a leader, a general of the army during the Revolutionary War. You probably get some items that come up there. All right, so moving right along with cognitive development, we have our friend Maslow. And Maslow said that we have emotional needs. We have different levels of needs. And once we can meet each level of need, we're able to move up to the next level. So here's a great pyramid that shows this. And you can see that needs begin down at the very basic, breathing, food, water, what we need to survive. Once we've met our physiological needs, we can move up to safety. The fact that people don't break into our houses, that we feel secure. Hopefully every student of mine has met safety and can move into the idea of love and belonging, feeling like you're a part of something. And so you can see you move up until the top part, which is known as self-actualization. This is where you're reaching your full potential. It doesn't mean you're perfect. It means that you know yourself very well and that you're able to reach these levels of problem solving, of spontaneity, of creativity, being able to recognize prejudice for what it is and remove it or work around it, to accept certain facts even when they're difficult. This is the goal, according to Maslow. Under humanism, we're all trying to get to the top here, this pinnacle to show that we're self-actualized. All right, my last slide. You guys have done great. Hang in there for a moment. Validity and reliability. These are some concepts that, again, you know, in psychology, we like to kind of mess around with how words are defined. These are some concepts I've noticed really confused my students. Validity is the idea that when a test or a study or an experiment says it will measure something, and it does measure that, it is valid. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Let's imagine that I took a personality test and I say, A, this test is valid because it gave me a response about my personality that I think is correct. Or B, this test is invalid because while it says it tests personality, it really seems to focus more on my aptitude. Which one is correct based on this definition of validity? Well, the correct answer would be B. Because it's not about whether or not I like the answers I got, it's about did the test measure what it says. So if I'm on test, if I take this test over here, let's look at A, and I don't like the responses it gives me, but it tested personality, it is valid, even if I don't like the answers. And I'm not going to like the answers of everything. That's okay. Could have to do with its standardization, could have to do with its reliability. Reliability has to do with if I took a test and each time I gave the same or similar answers, would I get the same or similar results? So let's find out which answer is better for reliability. A, I found this test unreliable because if I change my answers, I'll probably get a different result. Or B, this test is reliable because if I am honest, I'm likely to give similar answers and I think I'll get a similar result. Well, look at letter A. If you change your answers, do you want to get the same result? Probably not. So again, the answer here is B, because if you give the same or similar answers, you expect to get the same or similar result. If you don't, there's a problem with that test. So if, for example, if the first question asks me what's my favorite color and I say red, and it says I should belong to the Harry Potter House of Gryffindor, and the second time I take the test it says what's your favorite color and I say red, and it says, oh, well, you belong to Slytherin. That's not reliable. It's giving me different answers, even though I gave the same answer each time. All right, my friends, very good luck on your interim assessment 2. Please let me know if you have any questions or there's anything I can do to help you. And hopefully you all get very high scores. Good luck.